My daughter-in-law laughed when I signed the papers, and in that moment everyone in the room believed they had already won. I remember the sound clearly, not loud, not cruel in the obvious way people imagine cruelty, but light and satisfied, the kind of laugh someone lets out when a long plan finally works exactly the way they hoped it would. The conference room smelled faintly of polished wood and fresh paper, the kind of quiet, expensive office you find on the upper floors of downtown buildings where the windows stretch from floor to ceiling and the city looks small and distant below. Attorney Richard Coleman sat at the head of the table with a neat stack of documents in front of him, his silver reading glasses resting low on his nose as he flipped through the pages one last time. My son Daniel sat across from me, his hands folded together like a man trying very hard to appear calm. And beside him, my daughter-in-law Chloe leaned back comfortably in her chair, one leg crossed over the other, watching me with an expression that was almost cheerful. I was 68 years old that morning, and the pen in my hand felt heavier than it should have. Not because the paper was complicated, not because I didn't understand what everyone believed was happening, but because sometimes the smallest moments carry the weight of entire families, entire histories, entire lives. The pen hovered over the signature line, while the city traffic hummed far below the windows. I had lived in the same house for 41 years. Daniel took his first steps on the hardwood floor of the living room. His father built the back porch himself one summer when Daniel was 8, hammering boards in the evening heat, while our son chased fireflies across the yard. I could still picture that night clearly, the warm air, the smell of fresh-cut lumber, the sound of my husband laughing when Daniel tried to help and nearly dropped a box of nails. Families begin in small moments like that. Quiet moments. Simple ones. The kind no one imagines will someday lead to conference tables and legal documents. Chloe cleared her throat softly, the sound almost polite. "Mrs. Lawson," she said, her voice smooth and patient. "It's really just a formality." We all agreed this was the most practical solution. Practical. That was the word she liked to use lately. Practical when she suggested Daniel and I sell the lake cabin his father loved. Practical when she explained that the main house was too large for someone my age to manage. Practical when she started mentioning long-term care communities that had tennis courts and book clubs and smiling staff members who, according to her brochures, made residents feel independent and safe. I suppose if you repeat a word often enough, you begin to believe it means kindness. Daniel shifted in his chair and offered me a tight smile. "Mom," he said gently, "this just makes everything easier. Chloe and I will handle the property management, the taxes, all of that. You won't have to worry about anything anymore." The sentence hung in the air for a moment. You won't have to worry about anything anymore. It sounded generous, thoughtful even. And perhaps that's what made the moment so strangely quiet, because generosity usually doesn't require witnesses. Generosity doesn't usually come with legal counsel and 3 copies of every document. I looked down at the page again. The signature line waited patiently near the bottom, my full name printed neatly beside it, Margaret Elaine Lawson. I had written that name thousands of times in my life. On school forms, on mortgage checks, on birthday cards Daniel made when he was little, cards covered in crooked handwriting and glitter glue that took weeks to fully come off the kitchen table. Names carry stories inside them. Entire lifetimes sometimes. Chloe leaned slightly closer to Daniel and whispered something I couldn't quite hear. He nodded, and she smiled again, the same satisfied smile she'd been wearing since we arrived. It was the smile of someone watching a puzzle finally snap together. "Whenever you're ready," Attorney Coleman said calmly, sliding the document a few inches closer to me. His voice was neutral, professional, the way lawyers speak when they have conducted hundreds of meetings exactly like this one. I placed the pen against the paper. For a moment the room seemed very still. Outside the windows, the late morning sun reflected off the glass towers across the street. Somewhere down in the city a siren wailed briefly and then faded away. The world was continuing exactly as it always had. I signed my name slowly, carefully, making sure each letter looked exactly the way it always had. Margaret Elaine Lawson. When the pen lifted from the page, Chloe laughed. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a soft, satisfied laugh that slipped out before she could stop it. Daniel glanced at her quickly, surprised, but she simply covered her mouth with one hand and shook her head as if the moment had amused her more than she expected. Sorry, she said lightly. It's just, I didn't think that would be so easy. The sentence floated across the polished table like a feather. Daniel gave an awkward chuckle, the kind people use when they aren't sure how to react. I folded my hands in my lap and watched them both quietly. The pen rested beside the document now, its job finished. For a few seconds no one spoke. Then Attorney Coleman adjusted his glasses and looked down at the papers in front of him. The silence that followed was the kind of silence that only appears in very specific moments, the kind that feels calm on the surface but carries the faint sense that something important has not yet been said. I noticed the way the lawyer's fingers paused on the top page, the way his eyes moved carefully over the text, as if confirming something one last time. And then he cleared his throat softly. That was the moment when the room began to change, though Daniel and Chloe did not realize it yet. I did. Attorney Coleman cleared his throat gently, the sound quiet but deliberate, the kind of small signal that experienced professionals use when they are about to redirect the entire course of a conversation. Daniel leaned forward in his chair slightly, expecting the routine closing remarks that usually follow a signed document. Chloe sat back comfortably with that same satisfied smile still lingering on her face, her fingers loosely wrapped around the expensive leather folder she had brought with her. She looked like someone who had just completed a long checklist and was ready to move on to the next item in her day. Outside the tall windows, the city continued moving in its usual rhythm, cars sliding through intersections far below and sunlight reflecting across rows of glass buildings. Inside the conference room, everything felt contained, quiet, controlled. I folded my hands together and rested them on the table while Attorney Coleman adjusted the pages in front of him. For a few seconds he did not speak. He simply read something again, carefully, his eyes moving line by line as if confirming the exact wording. Daniel shifted in his chair and glanced between the lawyer and the signed document. Is everything set then? He asked, trying to sound relaxed. Chloe answered before the lawyer could. It should be, she said with easy confidence. We discussed everything last week. Her voice carried the calm certainty of someone who believed the outcome had already been decided. Attorney Coleman nodded slowly but did not immediately agree with her. Instead, he placed one hand flat against the document and looked up over his glasses. There is just one procedural step I need to complete before we conclude the meeting, he said. His tone was steady and neutral, yet there was a slight change in the air that I could feel even before Daniel noticed it. Daniel straightened slightly. Procedural step, he repeated. Chloe did not look concerned at all. She leaned her elbow on the table and brushed a strand of blonde hair behind her ear. Probably just a formal explanation for the record, she said lightly. Lawyers love those. The lawyer gave a polite nod, but did not smile. Something like that, he replied. He picked up the top page and turned it slowly so that the printed text faced him again. The quiet sound of paper sliding across the polished table echoed faintly in the room. Daniel looked at me briefly as if checking whether I felt comfortable with everything that had just happened. His expression was almost gentle, the same expression he used when he helped me carry groceries during his occasional visits. It reminded me of how easily people can convince themselves they are doing something kind, even when the truth is more complicated. Mom, this really is going to simplify things, he said reassuringly. You will not have to worry about maintenance costs or property taxes anymore. Chloe and I will take care of everything. Chloe nodded enthusiastically beside him. Exactly, she added. You deserve to relax at this stage of your life. At this stage of your life. That phrase had become one of her favorites during the past year. She used it whenever she wanted to sound thoughtful while gently moving me out of the center of my own decisions. I did not respond immediately. Instead, I watched Attorney Coleman as he placed both hands on the table and looked directly at the three of us. His expression remained calm, professional, almost academic. Mrs. Lawson, he said carefully. Before we finalize this transfer, I need to confirm that everyone in this room understands the structure of the Lawson Family Trust. Chloe blinked once, surprised by the sudden shift in topic, but she quickly recovered. Of course we understand it, she said. Daniel explained that the properties were originally placed in the trust years ago for tax purposes. Daniel nodded in agreement. Yes, my father set it up, but we already reviewed that part. Attorney Coleman acknowledged their response with a slight nod, yet he continued speaking in the same measured tone. The trust was indeed established by your father, Mr. Daniel Lawson Sr., Approximately 12 years ago, he said. However, the operational authority within the trust has a very specific structure. Chloe tilted her head slightly, the first faint trace of uncertainty appearing in her expression. Operational authority, she repeated. Meaning the person who retains final decision-making power regarding all assets contained within the trust, the lawyer explained. Daniel leaned forward again, frowning slightly. That would be shared between family members, correct? He asked. Attorney Coleman did not answer immediately. Instead, he reached for another document from the stack and opened it carefully. The pages inside were older, the paper slightly thicker than the newer forms we had just signed. He turned one page, then another, as if guiding everyone toward a particular paragraph. Chloe's smile had faded just a little now. She glanced at Daniel briefly before looking back at the lawyer. I thought that was already settled, she said. That is why we are here. The lawyer finally stopped turning pages and rested his finger on a single line of text. When he spoke again, his voice remained calm, but it carried the quiet clarity of someone stating a simple fact rather than beginning a debate. Actually, he said, that is the part that has not yet been clarified today. Daniel's brow tightened with confusion. What do you mean? He asked. Attorney Coleman lifted his eyes from the document and looked directly at him. I mean that according to the original trust agreement your father signed, the individual who holds final authority over every property within the Lawson family trust is not the person you may believe. The room became very still. Chloe's posture changed slightly as she sat straighter in her chair, her earlier confidence replaced by a careful watchfulness. Daniel looked from the lawyer to the document and back again, trying to follow the unexpected turn in the conversation. I remained quiet with my hands folded together on the table, watching both of them. Attorney Coleman adjusted his glasses one more time and spoke with calm precision. And before this meeting can legally conclude, he said, that authority must be acknowledged clearly by everyone present. The room remained silent for several seconds after Attorney Coleman finished his sentence, the kind of silence that stretches longer than anyone expects because every person present is waiting for someone else to explain what just happened. Daniel was the first to speak, his voice uncertain in a way I had not heard since he was a boy asking questions about something he did not fully understand. I am sorry, he said slowly, glancing between the lawyer and the document on the table. But I thought the authority inside the trust transferred to the family once my father passed away. Chloe nodded beside him, though her expression was no longer relaxed. The confident smile she had worn earlier was gone now, replaced by a careful focus, as if she were trying to catch every word before drawing a conclusion. Attorney Coleman did not react with surprise or impatience. Instead, he folded his hands together over the document and spoke with the calm clarity of someone explaining a rule that had always existed whether the others understood it or not. Your father anticipated that there might be confusion about this point, he said. That is precisely why he wrote the language of the trust in very specific terms. Daniel leaned closer to the table and looked down at the older pages that the lawyer had opened earlier. What specific terms? He asked. Chloe added quickly. Yes, because when we discussed the trust last year it sounded like all family assets would eventually be managed jointly. Her tone remained polite, but there was tension beneath it now, like the surface of a lake that begins to ripple before a storm arrives. Attorney Coleman turned the document slightly so that the printed paragraph faced Daniel and Chloe more directly. The sunlight from the tall windows reflected faintly across the page. Your father created the Lawson family trust with one primary purpose, the lawyer explained. To protect the long-term stability of the family properties. Daniel nodded slowly. Right. That makes sense. The lawyer continued speaking with steady patience. In order to do that, he established a managing authority inside the trust. That authority was designed to prevent sudden transfers, rushed sales, or external pressure that could affect the family assets. Chloe crossed her arms lightly and tilted her head. External pressure? She repeated. Attorney Coleman gave a small nod. Yes, situations where someone might attempt to influence the direction of the trust without fully understanding its structure. Daniel exhaled quietly and rubbed his forehead as if the explanation was becoming more complicated than he expected. So who exactly holds that authority now? He asked. The lawyer paused just long enough for the question to settle in the room. Outside the windows, a passing cloud shifted the sunlight slightly, casting a softer light across the conference table. I could see Chloe watching the lawyer closely now, her eyes narrowing just a little as she waited for the answer. Attorney Coleman spoke calmly. The managing authority did not transfer when your father passed away, he said. It remained exactly where he placed it when the trust was created. Daniel looked puzzled. But he created the trust 12 years ago, he said. At that time I assumed he would have listed himself as the authority. He did, the lawyer confirmed. But he also included a succession clause. Chloe leaned forward slightly now. Succession clause? She asked. The lawyer turned one more page in the document and tapped the margin gently with his finger. Your father believed that every structure needs a second level of protection, he said. He understood that time changes circumstances, and he wanted the trust to remain stable even after he was gone. Daniel's eyes followed the line of text that the lawyer indicated. So the authority passes to the next person listed, he said slowly. Attorney Coleman nodded. Correct. Chloe's voice came quickly now, sharper than before though she tried to keep it composed. And that next person would obviously be Daniel, she said. He is the only son. The lawyer looked at her politely, but did not confirm the assumption. The trust does not assign authority based solely on family position, he replied. It assigns authority based on the individual your father believed would best protect the properties. Daniel frowned slightly as he read the paragraph again. I do not remember him ever explaining that, he said quietly. I watched him carefully while he spoke. His expression was thoughtful now, almost uncertain, as if he was beginning to realize that there were parts of his father's planning he had never fully explored. Chloe turned toward him quickly. Daniel, this must just be legal language, she said, her voice carrying a note of forced reassurance. The important part is that we are consolidating everything now, so the responsibilities are easier to manage. Attorney Coleman did not interrupt her. Instead, he allowed the moment to pass before he spoke again. Mrs. Lawson, he said, turning his attention toward me for the first time since the discussion began. Before I continue, I would like to confirm something with you directly. I met his gaze calmly. Of course, I said. Daniel looked at me, then back at the lawyer. Chloe followed his movement, her eyes shifting quickly between both of us as if trying to anticipate what would be said next. Attorney Coleman rested one hand gently on the document. When your husband established the Lawson Family Trust 12 years ago, he said, he met with both of us privately several times to discuss the long-term protection of the properties. During those meetings, he made one decision very clear. Daniel straightened in his chair again. Chloe's posture stiffened slightly beside him. The lawyer continued speaking with careful precision. He decided that the person who would ultimately hold final authority over the trust after his lifetime would be the individual he trusted most to preserve the stability of the family. Daniel's voice came quietly now. And who is that? The lawyer did not look at Daniel when he answered. Instead, he looked directly at me again, his expression respectful and calm. According to the trust agreement your husband signed, he said clearly, that authority belongs to Mrs. Margaret Lawson. For a moment, no one in the room spoke. The words seemed to settle slowly across the polished table, as if they needed time to be understood. Daniel blinked once, then looked from Attorney Coleman to me with a confused expression that reminded me of the way he used to look when he was young and trying to solve a difficult math problem. Chloe did not blink at all. Her posture had gone perfectly still, her hands resting on the leather folder in front of her, as if she had forgotten she was holding it. I am sorry, Daniel said quietly after a few seconds. Did you say my mother holds the authority? Attorney Coleman nodded calmly. Yes, he replied. Margaret Lawson has been the managing authority of the Lawson Family Trust since the day it was created. Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair, as if the information had physically pushed him away from the table. But that does not make sense, he said. If that were true, then she would have been involved in every trust decision over the past 12 years. The lawyer folded his hands together again and answered with the same patient tone he had used throughout the meeting. She was, he said. Daniel frowned. No, she was not, he replied quickly. My father handled those decisions. Attorney Coleman gave a small nod. Your father handled the administrative tasks because he preferred to manage the details personally, he explained. However, the legal authority always rested with your mother. That was your father's intention from the beginning. Chloe finally shifted in her chair and leaned forward, the confidence that had filled her voice earlier now replaced with a careful sharpness. That cannot be correct, she said. Because if Margaret had full authority over the trust, then these transfer documents would not change anything. Attorney Coleman looked at her calmly. That is exactly the point, he said. The room grew quiet again. Daniel looked down at the signed page in front of him, then back at the lawyer. So what does that mean for the documents she just signed? He asked. The lawyer reached forward and gently tapped the paper with his finger. These documents authorize a proposed transfer of property management responsibilities, he said. However, they cannot override the authority structure inside the trust itself. Daniel stared at him. Meaning? Attorney Coleman spoke slowly and clearly. Meaning that the trust still recognizes Margaret Lawson as the individual who must approve any final change regarding those properties. Chloe's fingers tightened slightly around the leather folder. But she already signed, she said. Yes, the lawyer replied calmly. She signed the proposal. Daniel leaned forward again, his confusion turning into concentration. But if she signed the proposal, then the transfer should take effect, he said. Attorney Coleman shook his head gently. Not automatically, he explained. Under the trust agreement, the managing authority must also confirm that the transfer serves the long-term interest of the trust. Chloe's voice became sharper now. And what exactly does that mean? She asked. The lawyer turned the page again and pointed to a paragraph in the center of the document. It means that Margaret Lawson retains the right to approve or decline the final execution of the transfer after reviewing its impact, he said. Daniel's eyes widened slightly as he read the line the lawyer indicated. So, even though she signed this, he said slowly, she still has the authority to stop it? Correct, Attorney Coleman replied. Chloe looked at Daniel quickly. That is not what we discussed, she said under her breath. Daniel did not answer her immediately. He was still reading the paragraph in front of him, his expression tightening with each passing second as the structure of the trust became clearer. I remained quiet, watching both of them from across the table. The afternoon sunlight had shifted again outside the windows, casting a softer glow across the room. Attorney Coleman finally looked toward me again. Margaret, he said respectfully, your husband asked me to remind you of something if this situation ever occurred. Chloe looked up sharply at that sentence. Daniel also raised his head. What situation? He asked. The lawyer paused briefly before answering. A situation where someone might attempt to reorganize the trust without fully understanding how it was designed to function. Chloe inhaled slowly, clearly trying to maintain her composure. We understand perfectly well, she said. We were simply trying to simplify the management of the properties. Attorney Coleman nodded politely, but continued speaking to me. Your husband believed that one day you might feel pressured to sign something quickly, he said. He asked me to remind you that the trust was written specifically so that you would always have time to think before making a final decision. Daniel turned toward me again, his voice quieter now. Mom, he said, did you know about this? I looked at him calmly. Your father and I talked about many things over the years, I replied. Chloe watched my face carefully now, her earlier certainty completely gone. So what happens next? She asked the lawyer. Attorney Coleman sat back slightly in his chair and folded the document closed. Now, the managing authority of the trust decides whether the proposed transfer will move forward, he said. Daniel looked at me again, this time with a mixture of confusion and curiosity. And that authority belongs to you, he said slowly. I nodded once. The room felt different now, quieter but somehow heavier with understanding. Chloe glanced between Daniel and me as if trying to recalculate everything she believed had already been settled. Attorney Coleman rested his hands calmly on the table and spoke one final sentence in the same steady voice he had used from the beginning of the meeting. Mrs. Lawson, he said, the trust allows you to confirm the transfer today if you wish, but it also allows you to decline it entirely. The quiet that followed Attorney Coleman's last sentence felt deeper than the silence earlier in the meeting, because now everyone in the room understood that the direction of the conversation no longer belonged to Daniel or Chloe. The sunlight from the tall windows had shifted across the table and now rested on the stack of documents in front of me, illuminating the neat black lines of text and my signature at the bottom of the page. Daniel looked at me carefully, the confident certainty he had carried into the office now replaced by a thoughtful uncertainty. Chloe remained still beside him, though I could see the tension in her posture, the way her shoulders held themselves a little higher than before. For the first time since we arrived, she was not speaking immediately. Attorney Coleman sat quietly with his hands folded, allowing the room to settle before anyone said another word. I looked down at the document again, not because I needed to read it, but because sometimes silence helps people remember things more clearly. My husband believed that. He used to say that when conversations become too loud, the truth often hides behind the noise. I remembered one evening many years earlier when we were sitting on the back porch after dinner. The same porch he built himself with boards that still smelled like fresh pine when they were new. Daniel had been inside finishing homework while the two of us watched the summer sky turn orange above the trees behind the house. My husband had a habit of thinking quietly before he spoke, and that evening he rested his hands on the railing and said something that had stayed with me long after he was gone. He said that families are strongest when decisions are made slowly, not quickly, because time has a way of revealing which choices are built on patience and which ones are built on pressure. At the time I had smiled and asked him why he was suddenly sounding like a philosopher. He laughed and told me that when people build something that is meant to last for generations, they learn to think differently about time. Now, sitting in the conference room years later, I understood exactly what he meant. Daniel finally spoke again, his voice quieter than before. "Mom," he said gently, "if the trust gives you the authority, then the decision is completely yours. But Chloe and I were only trying to help you manage everything more easily." I looked at him and saw the same boy who used to run across the backyard chasing fireflies, though now he wore a press shirt and sat at a polished conference table inside a downtown law office. Life changes people slowly in ways they do not always notice. Chloe leaned slightly toward him. "Daniel is right," she said carefully, choosing her words more slowly now. "We only wanted to simplify things so that you would not have to worry about complicated responsibilities." Attorney Coleman remained silent, his calm expression revealing nothing about his own thoughts. I folded my hands together on the table again and let the quiet stretch for another moment before answering. "Your father never liked rushed decisions," I said softly. Daniel nodded automatically. "Yes, that sounds like him," he replied. Chloe did not speak. She was watching me now with the careful attention of someone who realizes that the outcome she expected may not unfold the way she imagined. I turned the page of the document slowly and read the paragraph Attorney Coleman had pointed out earlier. The words were simple but very precise, written the way legal language always is when someone intends for it to last many years without confusion. I could almost hear my husband's voice in the careful structure of those sentences, the same thoughtful patience he used whenever he repaired something around the house or explained a difficult idea to Daniel when he was younger. After a moment, I placed the page back on the table. Daniel leaned forward slightly, waiting for my answer. Chloe did the same, though her expression had become more guarded. I looked at both of them and then at the lawyer before speaking. "Your father built that trust to protect the family," I said calmly, "not to make decisions quickly." Daniel nodded again, though I could see the question in his eyes. "So what are you thinking?" he asked. I rested one hand on the document and considered the question for a moment. Outside the tall windows, the afternoon traffic had grown heavier, small lines of cars moving steadily through the city streets far below. The world continued in its ordinary rhythm, while our conversation waited quietly inside the conference room. Finally, I spoke again. "I think your father expected me to take my time," I said. Chloe's fingers tightened slightly around the edge of her folder. "What does that mean?" she asked carefully. I looked at her with the same calm expression I had worn since the beginning of the meeting. "It means that signing a proposal is not the same as approving the final transfer," I said. Daniel sat back slowly in his chair as the meaning of that sentence became clear. Chloe remained still for a moment longer before speaking again. "So you were saying the transfer might not happen today?" she asked. I turned the page of the document again and placed it neatly back into the folder in front of me. Then I looked up at Attorney Coleman. "How much time does the trust allow for the final review?" I asked. The lawyer answered without hesitation. "As long as the managing authority believes is necessary," he said calmly. Daniel looked between the two of us as if the room had shifted slightly around him. Chloe said nothing at all. I closed the folder gently and rested my hands on top of it. The room had grown very quiet again, but this time the silence belonged to me. The silence that settled over the conference room after I closed the folder felt different from the earlier quiet. Before, everyone believed the meeting had already reached its conclusion. Now the room felt like a place where the outcome had only just begun to unfold. Daniel sat with his hands resting on the table, his expression thoughtful in a way that reminded me of how he used to look when he was deciding whether to trust his instincts or someone else's advice. Chloe, on the other hand, had grown very still. Her earlier confidence had not disappeared completely, but it had shifted into something sharper, something more watchful. She glanced briefly at the closed folder in front of me, and then at Attorney Coleman, as if she were trying to determine exactly how much control had slipped out of her hands. Attorney Coleman remained calm and composed, his posture relaxed but attentive. He had clearly conducted enough meetings like this one to understand when the balance of a conversation had changed. Daniel finally cleared his throat. "Mom," he said carefully, "no one expected you to feel rushed. If you want more time, that is completely understandable." His voice was sincere, though beneath it I could hear the quiet tension of someone trying to recover from a surprise. Chloe nodded quickly beside him. "Of course," she added, her tone polite but slightly tight. "We simply thought it would be easier for everyone to finalize everything today." Easier. It was another one of those words that sounded generous on the surface, but often meant something very different when examined closely. I rested my hands on top of the folder and looked across the table at both of them. The sunlight had shifted again across the room, reflecting softly against the glass wall behind Attorney Coleman and casting a warm glow across the polished wood surface of the table. "Your father believed that important decisions should never be made quickly," I said calmly. Daniel nodded once. "Yes," he said quietly. "He did say things like that." Chloe leaned forward slightly now. "Margaret," she said, using my first name in the same friendly tone she often used when she wanted to sound supportive. "We understand that this might feel overwhelming. But remember that Daniel and I only want to help you manage things more easily." I looked at her for a moment before answering. "Managing something and owning something are not the same," I said. She blinked once, clearly not expecting that response. Daniel glanced between us, his expression tightening slightly as he realized the conversation was shifting again. Attorney Coleman remained silent, allowing the discussion to move naturally without interruption. Chloe straightened in her chair and folded her hands together. "Of course," she replied carefully. "But Daniel and I assumed that the trust was designed so the family could share responsibility eventually." I nodded slowly. "The trust was designed to protect the family," I said. Daniel leaned forward again, resting his elbows lightly on the table. "Mom, if you want to review everything again, we can absolutely do that," he said. "There is no pressure." I appreciated the words, though the room still carried the faint memory of Chloe's earlier laugh when she believed the outcome was already decided. Sometimes small sounds linger in the air longer than people realize. I turned slightly toward Attorney Coleman. "You mentioned that my husband expected this situation might happen," I said. The lawyer nodded calmly. "Yes," he replied. "Your husband believed that there might come a time when someone would suggest reorganizing the trust." Chloe shifted slightly at that sentence, though she said nothing. "And what exactly did he say about that possibility?" I asked. Attorney Coleman opened the older trust document again and ran his finger gently along the margin before answering. "He said that if such a moment ever arrived, I should remind you of one very simple question," the lawyer said. Daniel watched him closely now. Chloe did the same. "What question?" Daniel asked. The lawyer lifted his eyes from the document and looked at me with quiet respect. "He asked that you consider whether the change being proposed would strengthen the stability of the family or simply make things more convenient in the moment," he said. The room became quiet again after those words. Daniel leaned back slowly, absorbing the meaning. Chloe looked down briefly at the table, then back up again, clearly calculating how the conversation might still move in her favor. I rested one hand on the folder and thought about the house where Daniel had grown up, the porch where his father used to sit in the evenings watching the sunset, the small apple tree we planted in the backyard the year Daniel started high school. Those things were never meant to be rushed decisions or convenient solutions. They were pieces of a life that had taken decades to build. I looked up again and met Daniel's eyes first. "Your father spent years building what we have," I said gently. "He did not do that so it could be reorganized in one afternoon." Daniel nodded slowly. Chloe spoke next, her voice calm, but noticeably more careful now. "No one is trying to erase what your husband built," she said. "We are simply trying to adapt to the future." I considered that statement for a moment before responding. The future does not need to arrive all at once. I said quietly. Attorney Coleman closed the trust document again and folded his hands on the table. The room felt balanced again, though not in the same way it had been earlier. This time the balance rested on patience rather than expectation. I looked at the closed folder in front of me, and then back at the two people sitting across the table. I will review everything carefully, I said. Daniel nodded immediately. Chloe hesitated for half a second before nodding as well. I lifted the folder slightly and slid it toward my side of the table. For now, I said calmly. Nothing will be transferred today. For several seconds after I said that nothing would be transferred today, no one moved. The quiet in the conference room felt steady now, not tense like before, but deliberate, as if the air itself had slowed down to match the pace of the decision. Daniel leaned back in his chair and let out a long breath he had probably been holding for several minutes. Chloe did not lean back. She remained sitting upright, her hands folded neatly on top of the leather folder she had brought with her, though the careful composure she maintained no longer carried the same confidence it had earlier in the meeting. Attorney Coleman watched the room with the calm patience of someone who understood that moments like this rarely ended with raised voices. They ended with realization. Daniel finally spoke again, his voice softer than it had been when we first sat down at the table. "That is fair," he said quietly. "You should take as much time as you need." I nodded once in acknowledgement. Chloe glanced at him quickly before speaking herself. "Of course," she added, though her voice sounded more measured now, each word chosen with extra care. "We only wanted to help move things forward." I did not respond immediately. Instead, I rested my hands on the closed folder and looked at the document stack that Attorney Coleman had placed neatly to one side. For years, my husband had believed that documents were like maps. If someone studied them long enough, they revealed the path people were trying to take. Daniel followed my gaze and then looked back at me. "Mom," he said, "when did Dad explain the trust to you?" It was an honest question, and I could hear genuine curiosity behind it. Chloe turned toward me as well, clearly interested in the answer even though she tried to appear indifferent. I thought about that question for a moment before speaking. "Not all at once," I said. "Your father never believed important things should be explained in a single conversation." Daniel nodded slowly. "That sounds like him," he replied. I could almost see the memory forming behind his eyes, the same thoughtful way he used to listen when his father gave advice that took time to understand. Chloe shifted slightly in her chair. "But if the trust has existed for 12 years, she said carefully, "why did you never mention being the managing authority before?" Her tone remained polite, but the question carried a quiet edge beneath it. I looked at her calmly. "Because your father never believed authority should be used as a conversation piece," I said. Attorney Coleman gave a small approving nod, though he said nothing. Daniel leaned forward again, resting his forearms lightly on the table. "So Dad planned all of this a long time ago," he said thoughtfully. "Yes," I replied. "Long before anyone believed it might become necessary." Chloe's expression tightened slightly, though she tried to mask it with a polite smile. "Necessary for what exactly?" she asked. I turned my attention back to the lawyer. "Richard," I said, using his first name the way my husband always had. "When my husband discussed the trust with you, did he ever explain why he designed it this way?" Attorney Coleman folded his hands and nodded slowly. "He did," he said. Daniel looked at him with renewed interest. Chloe did the same. "Your husband believed that family structures change over time," the lawyer continued calmly. "He understood that relationships evolve, and he wanted the trust to remain stable regardless of those changes." Daniel frowned slightly. "That sounds like he expected problems," he said. Attorney Coleman shook his head gently. "Not problems," he clarified. "Possibilities." Chloe crossed her arms lightly. "That sounds like a careful way of saying the same thing," she replied. The lawyer offered a small smile that remained perfectly professional. "Your husband preferred to prepare for possibilities rather than react to surprises," he said. The room grew quiet again. I could see Daniel thinking about that explanation, measuring it against the memories he carried of his father. Chloe glanced briefly at the closed folder in front of me before speaking again. "Margaret," she said, returning to that friendly tone she liked to use. "You know Daniel, and I only want what is best for the family." I nodded slowly. "I believe that you believe that," I said. Daniel looked up at that response, surprised by the careful wording. Chloe blinked once, clearly unsure how to interpret the sentence. Attorney Coleman adjusted the position of his glasses and quietly gathered the loose pages into a neat stack. Mrs. Lawson, he said respectfully, whenever you feel ready to review the documents again, my office will assist you in any way you need. I nodded in appreciation. Daniel stood from his chair then, pushing it back slightly from the table. Maybe we should give Mom some time to think, he said. Chloe remained seated for another moment before standing as well. Her movements were slower now than when the meeting began, as if the outcome had forced her to reconsider every step she had taken earlier that morning. I lifted the folder from the table and held it comfortably against my side. The weight of it felt familiar, like carrying a piece of the life my husband and I had built together. As we walked toward the glass door of the conference room, Daniel paused beside me. Mom, he said quietly, Dad trusted you to make the right decision. I met his eyes and gave a small nod. Your father trusted patience, I replied. Behind us, Chloe said nothing at all. The hallway outside Attorney Coleman's office felt quieter than the conference room we had just left, though the city noise still hummed faintly through the tall windows that lined the corridor. Daniel walked beside me in silence for several steps, while Chloe moved slightly ahead of us, her posture straight and purposeful, as if she were determined to keep her thoughts hidden behind calm movements. I held the folder comfortably against my side and followed the polished floor toward the elevator lobby at the end of the hall. The building was one of those modern glass towers downtown where everything seemed designed to feel clean and orderly, the kind of place where voices stayed low, and conversations carried more weight because people expected important decisions to happen there. Daniel finally spoke once we reached the waiting area near the elevators. Mom, he said gently, I hope today did not feel uncomfortable for you. I looked at him and gave a small smile. Conversations about family property are rarely comfortable, I replied calmly. He nodded, understanding that truth immediately. Chloe turned slightly when she heard our voices, but did not interrupt. She stood with her arms loosely folded while watching the elevator numbers above the doors. When the elevator arrived and the door slid open, the three of us stepped inside together. The ride down from the 22nd floor was quiet except for the soft mechanical hum of the elevator cables moving through the shaft. Daniel kept glancing toward the folder in my hand, clearly still thinking about the conversation that had taken place upstairs. Chloe looked straight ahead at the polished steel doors, her expression composed but distant. When the elevator reached the lobby level, the doors opened and sunlight from the large glass entrance spilled across the marble floor. We stepped out into the open space where people moved calmly through the building, some heading toward offices, others leaving for late afternoon meetings or early dinners. Daniel slowed his pace slightly as we approached the exit. Mom, he said again, I want you to know that Chloe and I never intended to pressure you. I nodded once. I believe that you believed you were helping, I said gently. Chloe stopped walking when she heard that sentence and turned toward me. Margaret, she said carefully, I hope you do not think we were trying to take advantage of you. Her voice was calm, but there was a careful intensity behind it now. I considered the question before answering. I think sometimes people become focused on solving a problem quickly, I said. And when that happens, they stop asking whether the problem truly needs to be solved in that moment. Daniel listened quietly beside her, clearly thinking about the words. Chloe watched my face closely as if searching for a clearer answer hidden somewhere in the calm tone of my voice. Outside the glass doors, the afternoon sunlight stretched across the sidewalk, and the steady movement of downtown traffic continued along the street in front of the building. Daniel placed his hands in his pockets and looked toward the city for a moment before speaking again. Dad always said you were the patient one, he said. I guess that is why he trusted you with the trust. I smiled faintly at the memory of that familiar sentence. Your father trusted patience itself, I replied. Chloe glanced toward the folder again. So what happens now? She asked. The question hung in the air between us as people walked past the building entrance behind her. I adjusted the folder slightly in my hand before answering. Now I read everything carefully, I said. Daniel nodded immediately. Chloe waited a moment longer before responding. And after you read it? She asked. I looked out through the glass doors toward the busy street and the rows of buildings beyond it. The city had changed a great deal over the years, but the rhythm of life moving forward always remained the same. After that, I said calmly, I decide what protects the family best. Chloe studied my expression for a second longer, perhaps hoping for a clearer indication of which direction that decision might take. Daniel reached for the door handle and held it open as we stepped out onto the sidewalk. The late afternoon air carried the faint warmth of early summer, and the sound of traffic blended with distant conversations from people passing along the street. We stood there for a moment beside the entrance to the building. Daniel looked thoughtful, as if he were slowly realizing that the trust his father created had never been about quick solutions. Chloe looked toward the street, clearly measuring the situation in her own mind. I held the folder comfortably against my side and watched the sunlight reflect off the glass windows of the surrounding buildings. For the first time since the meeting began that morning, the future felt exactly the way my husband had intended it to feel. Unrushed, open, and entirely mine to consider. We stood on the sidewalk for a moment after leaving the building, the glass doors closing quietly behind us as the afternoon city noise filled the air. Cars moved steadily along the street, sunlight reflecting off windshields and tall office windows, and somewhere down the block a street vendor was speaking to a group of tourists who had stopped to ask for directions. Daniel looked thoughtful as he watched the traffic, the same quiet concentration I had seen in him many times over the years whenever he was trying to understand something larger than the moment itself. Chloe stood beside him with her arms loosely crossed, though the careful confidence she carried earlier that morning had changed into something more restrained, something that suggested she was reconsidering every step that had brought us to this point. I held the folder comfortably against my side and breathed in the warm afternoon air, allowing the steady rhythm of the city to settle the thoughts moving through my mind. Daniel finally spoke again after a minute of silence. "Mom," he said gently, "I know Dad trusted you with the trust, and I respect that. I just hope this does not create distance between us." His voice was sincere, and I could hear the quiet concern behind it. I turned toward him and gave a small reassuring nod. "Your father never created that trust to divide the family," I said calmly. "He created it to make sure the family would always think carefully before making decisions that could not be undone." Daniel absorbed that answer slowly. Chloe glanced between us, clearly weighing whether she should respond. After a moment she did. "Margaret," she said, her voice controlled but serious now, "I understand that you want time to review everything. But the properties require planning. Taxes, maintenance, management decisions. Those things cannot wait forever." I looked at her with the same calm expression I had carried throughout the day. "You are right," I replied. "They cannot wait forever." Chloe seemed relieved to hear that acknowledgement, though she waited for the rest of the sentence. "But they can wait long enough to be handled properly," I continued. Daniel nodded slowly beside her, as if the meaning of those words was beginning to settle into place. We began walking down the sidewalk together, the city stretching ahead of us in long lines of glass and steel buildings that reflected the late afternoon light. People moved around us with the steady energy of downtown life, each person focused on their own destination, while our conversation continued quietly among the passing footsteps. Daniel slipped his hands into his jacket pockets and looked at the folder again. "Dad must have spent years planning the trust," he said thoughtfully. I smiled slightly. "He did," I replied. "He believed that building something strong required patience." Chloe walked a few steps ahead before slowing and turning slightly toward us. "So what will you look for when you review the documents?" she asked. It was a practical question, though the way she asked it suggested she was still trying to determine whether the outcome could eventually move in the direction she had expected earlier that morning. I thought about the question for a moment before answering. Important to rush. And now, for the first time since we walked into that conference room, everyone finally understood that.